morning and welcome to the Existential Mitigation, the Future of Climate Cooperation webinar, which is brought to you by the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the US Embassy here in Canberra. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land where I am right now, the Ngunnawal people, and I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you all are joining me tonight, as well as the First Nations people all over the world who serve as the primary caretakers of this planet. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. To get into tonight, our main topic is climate change, of course. The Indo-Pacific is the most exposed region in the world to climate hazards, and most of Australia's closest neighbors are among the most vulnerable. But of course, Australia and the US, who are going to be the two main countries of focus tonight, feel their fair share of climate disaster as well. As we speak, the east coast of Australia is battered with catastrophic weather conditions, starting in Queensland, which was mostly underwater for much of last week, and it has now spread down to New South Wales. Homes, communities, and lives have been affected by torrential days and days of torrential rainfall / flooding, and with more than a year's worth of rainfall over the course of a single week. Dams that have been empty have now been full to the overflowing, and recent droughts have meant that the climate has not been prepared to take on this amount of rain all at once. We have an unfortunate loss of at least 17 lives. And my thoughts are with all of the families who have experienced those losses. In the United States, there's destruction from storms and tornadoes sweeping across the country. Iowa experienced fatal tornadoes much earlier in the year than usual, and a mix of Arctic cold and tropical air is expected to lead to further major snowstorms stretching across most of the country, with the general weather patterns expecting to worsen. Coming out of winter snowstorms, we are seeing record-breaking warm temperatures, and in this week alone, an estimated 20 to 30 degrees above average in the eastern US. I would expect that to be Fahrenheit, I hope. And of course we have the ongoing crisis in California and much of the East Coast. California is where I'm from. The fires are something that are a constant worry for my family, my friends, and just generally the place that I love. So yes, that is where we are at right now. In some good news, there have been some extremely promising developments in climate policy and technology over the past couple of years, and some very exciting things coming out of the Glasgow Climate Summit from last year, which was kind of the instigator for this event. So here to talk to us tonight about the road from Glasgow to 2030 and beyond, we have three exceptionally accomplished speakers who are all leaders in the climate policy and action space. For our audience, following their opening statements, I will open the floor for questions from you. This will be through the Q&A chat function. I have that open. I should have that open now, and if I don't, I will get that open as soon as possible. I have the upvote function turned on so that if you see a question that you really want to see answered, please give it an upvote and it will float up the list of questions. We will do our best to get through as many of those questions as possible tonight. So first up, we have Blake Crystal, who is a Senior Development Counselor with USAID. Hello, Blake. Thank you, Blake. Blake is, as I said, Senior Development Counselor with USAID here in Canberra. Prior to that, Blake served in Afghanistan as the USAID Deputy Mission Director and has had previous postings in Botswana, South Africa, and Moldova with USAID. Joining Blake, we have Amanda McKenzie, who is the CEO of Climate Council. Hello, Amanda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Amanda is one of the best known public commentators on the climate crisis here in Australia. Prior to working with Climate Council, Amanda co-founded the Australia Youth Climate Coalition, and she has served on expert panels on renewable energy for Queensland and the Northern Territory governments. And then finally tonight we have Annika Reynolds. Hello, Annika.
Hello, everyone.
Annika is a young leader in the climate justice movement and a non-binary advocate. Annika is the CEO and founder of Green Law, which is a youth-led research initiative that leverages the vision of the next generation of legal researchers and lawyers to tackle the climate crisis. And Annika is also the inaugural youth chair of the Environment and Human Rights at Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. So those are our fantastic speakers that you'll hear from tonight. If you have questions for any of them, please don't hesitate to ask. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Blake. Thank you, Blake.
Great, thank you, Nancy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Nancy already introduced me. My name is Blake Crystal. I'm a USA Foreign Service Officer based here in Canberra. And just let me start by saying thank you both to Nancy, but the team at the Australian Institute of International Affairs for putting this together tonight. This is great. And also to our two other speakers, Amanda and Annika. So great to have you all here, and thanks for doing this. And I appreciate your intro. That's great. I don't have to get into my background. About the only thing I will add, just in terms of better understanding kind of my perspective and where I'm coming from. In my career as a development professional, I've worked a lot on many of the issues around climate change mitigation, adaptation programs itself, everything from working at the grassroots level to my time in DC working at the policy level. So I think I have a pretty good perspective in terms of not just what we talked about, but also how it impacts communities on the ground floor in the developing world. So just to throw that out there to start. So in my time this evening, and I did time myself, I got 10 minutes and I timed myself at 7, which means I'll probably go over. So I'm counting on Nancy to cut me off because I tend to go down rabbit holes sometimes. But I do have a few things I want to share with our listeners. First, I just want just a really brief overview of what we do at USAID, talk about my role here in Australia and what I'm doing as a development professional, and then a little bit about what USAID does in terms of climate change programming. And then I'll end with just a quick real world example of an ongoing program that we have in the region where we're partnering with Australia to address climate change. So hopefully we'll go 10 minutes and then we get to the real fun, which will be hearing from our two other speakers, and then of course the Q&A, which I absolutely love. So looking forward to that. Great, so first off, I just want to say a bit about USAID. It's kind of our tagline, and when I do any public speaking, if I don't say this, I don't get my paycheck. So I think a lot of people, I'm assuming, are familiar with what we do, but just in case, I work for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and we're an independent agency of the U.S. federal government, and we're responsible for administering civilian foreign aid and development assistance. Okay, so that's what we do. Our budget, 25-30 billion. So we are one of the, if not the largest official aid agency in the world, and we account for more than half of all U.S. foreign assistance. And I think that's the highest in the world in terms of absolute dollar values. And we work all around the world, in over 100 countries, focusing on promoting global health, supporting global stability, humanitarian assistance. We also look at catalyzing innovation and partnership and empowering women and girls. So those are some of our core areas. Okay, so got that out of the way. Check the box there. Next, a little bit about my role in Australia. And it's great when I have an opportunity to speak because I get this question a lot. What is USA doing in Australia? This is a new position. I'm the first USA Foreign Service Officer to be assigned to Australia. And just to get it out of the way, we aren't implementing programs in Australia. We work in the developing world, so we're not doing anything in Australia. My role here is primarily a policy role, and it's looking at our partnership with Australia. So it's in line with what I talked about in terms of USAID's mission, looking at how we advance U.S. national security and prosperity, and also our work demonstrating American generosity. But we look at sustainable development in partner countries. And one of the things we've done is we've looked at, made a concerted effort to expand and deepen foreign assistance cooperation and looking at like-minded donors, such as Australia. So with that in mind, we opened up an office here in August of 2021, so last year. And really two main objectives here, and they're really advanced U.S. foreign policy or foreign assistance priorities in the Indo-Pacific and approve alignment between Australia and the United States government in terms of our development investments, especially in the small island states of the South Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region. So that's what I'm doing here. And I primarily work with my counterparts over at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, and looking at their different development institutions and how the US and Australia can cooperate better. So that's a little bit about me, my agency, and what I'm doing. So now a little bit about what my agency does in terms of climate change. And when I talk about what we do, it's our programming, right? So this is kind of, just a quick overview of USAID climate programming. And I think, if you're on this call and you have an interest in the issue, and Nancy got into it a little bit in her intro, climate change is a threat, and it sees no borders, right? And it can harm everyone. So we're around the world, we're seeing more extreme weather events. Temperatures are rising, sea levels are rising. We have intense forest fires in California that you mentioned. Prolonged droughts in the Horn of Africa, typhoons in Southeast Asia. So much of the world is already, experiencing the negative impact of climate change, of a changing climate, right? So addressing the crisis really has to be a collective effort. And, the US government, my country, we're committed to renewing alliances. For example, what I'm doing here in Australia, and dealing with the crisis, cooperating with our global partners, and strengthening, our global climate ambition, right? So, if you think about climate change, and this is great, if you look at the title of this event tonight, it's not just an existential threat. It threatens our development progress. It makes global inequities more acute. It increases water and food scarcity. It increases the need for humanitarian assistance. Refugees, displacement, and it contributes to conflict. And these are all things that I think a lot of folks probably know. Okay, so what does that mean for USAID and for the US government? So, as the lead US government agency for development and humanitarian assistance, USAID plays a central role in climate action. So if you've looked at what's coming out of our administration, the Biden-Harris administration has really underscored climate as a key to our development. And the head of my agency, Samantha Power, she even called USAID a climate agency, right? And that's how important it is to us. So in terms of what we're doing and how we approach that, we really integrated into our programming is mitigation of climate change, right? And addressing the impacts of climate change and the changing climate by partnering. I think we're in about 45, 46 countries now. And we have programs that look at emissions reductions, looking at protecting critical ecosystems, the transition to renewable energy, building resilience against the impacts of climate change, and promoting the flow of capital towards climate positive investments, okay? So that's kind of what it looks like now. In terms of going forward and what we're doing, we're working right now on a plan to finalize a climate strategy that will guide our work through 2030. And this is right now we're looking at public comments and integrating those responses into our draft. That's what we're doing on now. So our previous strategy and what we've been working on for a while really focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. The new strategy, in addition to mitigation and adaptation, is also going to look at the need to supplement our direct climate change work with kind of an all hands on deck approach and integrating climate action into everything we do as a development agency. We're also going to look at focusing on catalyzing change across complex systems such as food, water, energy, financial side of development, governance, health, and impacts that go far, far beyond what we can achieve just in a single sector. So more cross-cutting. And probably more importantly, it really elevates equity as a core goal, including supporting structural changes that improve participation and leadership for Indigenous people, local communities, women, youth, climate action, and at least 40 partners by 2030. Okay, so this is really kind of our forward-looking goal. And it really goes, helping countries translate climate ambition into on-the-ground impact. And it goes hand in hand with meeting kind of the financial needs of tackling climate change. Okay, so Let's see. So I think I said I wanted to end with a practical example of what we do. How am I doing time-wise, Nancy? I'm not timing myself, but I feel maybe got another couple of minutes left.
Yep, 2 to 3 minutes. Go ahead.
Awesome. All right. Great. So, I wanted to just explain a little bit about what I do, about my agency, kind of our global approach to climate change. And I think that's good. Talk a little about, the strategies that we have, at the high level, but then kind of take it down to what does that mean? So what does it mean as a development agency? What does it mean when we're working overseas? So we have some excellent examples in the Indo-Pacific. We have our kind of our approach is called Climate Ready, and we've already mobilized about $230 million in the Pacific and Southeast Asia for institutions to receive accreditation of climate finance. And then the one example that I kind of wanted to end with is a program that we have that's in the Mekong River Basin. Okay, so it's in the Pacific, and it kind of gets at what we do. It's also one of the programs that we have where we're working, doing a joint program with Australia. So doing a joint program with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So in the Mekong River Basin, it's a vital biodiversity area, and it's a source of livelihood for, and I think it's around 70, 80 million people. And there's a lot of infrastructure investment going on in the region. And that's good. I mean, we want to see that broad-based economic development, and infrastructure is core to that, right? But a lot of times these infrastructure projects are developed at the expense of communities and the environment. So in partnership with Australia, USAID launched a program called the Mekong Safeguards Program, and jointly funded by USAID and DFAT. So it's implemented by our partner, the Asia Foundation, and it helps countries apply environmental, social, and corporate governance, what we call ESG, at the local, national, and transboundary levels as they look at improving environmental and social income or social outcomes for infrastructure. So this is a key thing, a key part of the program. And really the mission of that program is to accelerate what we call sustainable infrastructure transition in the Mekong by reducing negative impacts of the environmental and social inputs and looking at issues of how it affects the planet. So these are large-scale energy and infrastructure projects in places like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam. So that's just one example. We have some good examples also in other parts of the Indo-Pacific working on issues like fisheries and economic livelihood and the impacts of climate change on that, disaster risk reduction. But I'm happy to go into some of those things. So I think on that, I met my goals of telling you a little bit about myself, my agency, and then giving you one example of our programming. I'm gonna stop there because, like I said, I'm looking forward to two things. One, to hear from other speakers, and then the second thing is the question and answers, where I think we can really pull the threads on some of these issues and hear more. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you so much, Blake. That was fantastic. Really interesting to hear what USAID is doing and how it's doing that. And I have a few questions for you for later. But before that, let's hear from Amanda.
Thanks, Nancy, and lovely to hear from you, Blake. I wanted to start by talking a bit about the floods. And for those who may be joining us from overseas and may not have seen this, as Nancy mentioned in the early stages, there's huge flooding in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland at the moment, and the scale and the speed of the disaster is still unfolding, but it's just breathtaking. One of the records was the Lismore flood, which is 2 meters above the previous flood record about 50 odd years ago. So it's broken records in an enormous way, and communities remain cut off. There's a dire need for fresh water and food. The army's had to go in. It's an incredibly serious event. And these communities that are experiencing these flood events, many have experienced these mega floods that are often described as unprecedented a number of times in the last decade. And many communities have also experienced the Black Summer fires, which were an incredibly serious disaster two years ago, and which affected communities from southern Queensland all the way down to Tasmania. At the worst time of the fires, almost every major forest on the east coast down from Brisbane was on fire at the same time. So absolutely, Australia is seeing the consequences of climate change now. And in the same time that these floods sort of kicked off, we had the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released last week that makes it yet again crystal clear that climate change is intensifying extreme weather events, including rainfall. So in this case, rainfall is made worse because as a hotter climate means that there's more evaporation, more water in the atmosphere, that then when there is a rainfall event, we're probabilistically seeing more of these extreme weather events. So it's very clear that we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions this decade. So climate change isn't a footnote in this story, it's the story. And we've had some politicians claim that it's unprecedented, that we couldn't have predicted these sorts of events. But of course, scientists have been telling us now for decades that these sorts of events are the type of thing that we can expect. And unfortunately, we're seeing it. And as others have said, not just in Australia, obviously, but right around the world. And there's been catastrophic events in the United States as well. And importantly, it's the compounding nature of these events. So it's one that happens, and then another one happens, and then another one happens, and then another one happens. So many communities are still, reeling from Black Summer, from other floods that have happened in these regions, and then they haven't had a chance to rebuild. And that's not just true, of course, of human communities, it's also native animals. We see huge losses in native wildlife, particularly koalas, for instance, in the northern New South Wales. And these flooding events will be catastrophic for native animals as well. A couple of points that we've been making in the last week is that being unprecedented, it's no reason to be unprepared. So as I said, there's been lots of warning about these type of events, that they're likely to happen. And we had a Royal Commission investigate the Black Summer bushfires because they were the worst disaster that Australia had had, which followed from many other bushfire Royal Commissions and inquiries. And that Royal Commission found that natural disasters have changed, and it was clear that disaster management arrangements must also change. So that's one important area for government that hasn't been actioned at all adequately yet, is to prepare for the types of events that we have not yet experienced, like the ones we're currently seeing. So we were not prepared for Black Summer, we're not prepared for the floods we're currently seeing. We were not able to deploy the military quick enough into these areas. People, as you may well have seen on the news, communities doing their own swiftwater rescue, often being in very dangerous conditions with no training, rescuing their friends and neighbours. It's not a situation anyone ever wants to be in, and it's a remarkable efforts of bravery, but we don't want to be putting citizens in those circumstances. We need to properly resource our first responders so they have the personnel and the capacity to be out there doing that work when these disasters come. So one of the critical questions for Australia is, where are our leaders? And we've been very clear about the Morrison government following from the Turnbull and the Abbott government. Over the last 8 years, there has not been meaningful action to tackle the climate crisis. We've been really buoyed to see the United States stepping up action under the Biden administration. It's been very clear that that's having waves around the world of influence. And Australia, I think we can see that our leaders have been influenced by the shift in American foreign policy, but still Australia has a very weak 2030 target. We were very late to the party in announcing a net zero target by 2050 to get down our emissions. But our 2030 target is very weak and way out of line with what the science suggests it's required. Our scientists have done some analysis, and their number that they came up with is a 75% reduction by 2030 to be in line with what's happening around the world and be in line with staying below 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, which is the international threshold that's been agreed. So for Australia that has been reliant on burning coal, oil and gas, we need to shift quickly. That's happening at a state level, at a local level, at a business level, but it's not happening fast enough given the slowness that the federal government has been appreciating how serious this issue is. We need to move away from our fossil fuel exports as well as domestic use of these. Fortunately, in the Australian scenario, we're the sunniest country in the world, we're one of the windiest, we have huge opportunities here to make the most of it. And that's what I would love to see Australia embrace. There's many commentators now that talk about Australia going way beyond 100% renewables to go to 200%, 500%, so that we can power not just our electricity system, but also our transportation, manufacturing. Could we have new manufacturing industries in green steel, for instance, green aluminium, because we have such an abundance of clean energy, we've got lots of space, we've got lots of capacity to be building jobs, particularly across regional Australia, which is always calling out for new opportunities. So we have a federal election coming up in Australia in probably just a couple of months. And we released a statement today, actually, on the floods, noting that climate change is escalating the risk of these type of floods and it's hurting Australians right now, and calling on our federal parliament to do one, or for all political parties to note how serious this is and that climate change is playing a role in these mega floods, and two, prepare our emergency services and communities for this inevitable wave of increasingly disastrous events. Three, to tell us how they plan to massively scale down our pollution in the next term of parliament, but ultimately in this decade, to get us on the way to 75% reduction and then to zero. And also, when we're responding to these disasters, it's not just the immediate response, but also how we rebuild. So a big conversation for us, as well as communities around the world, has to be, how do we respond once these disasters happen? Because the communities that have been affected this week are the same communities that will probably be affected by future extreme weather events of this nature. So we need to make sure that in the rebuild, that we're not putting people in harm's way all over again that cannot be insured, that end up destitute as a consequence of the extreme weather events. So I'll end it there, Nancy. Love to answer any questions people have.
Thank you so much for that, Amanda. I think like the whole concept of unprecedented events happening over and over and over again is it's wild to watch and even more concerning to experience. So I'm interested to hear what our audience wants to know more about that and what we can do to respond. Next up, let's hear from Annika.
Good evening, everyone. Yes, my name is Annika, and I'm both young and, importantly, non-binary, so please use they, them pronouns for me. And first, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Tonight's event, as acknowledged by Nancy and Amanda, is being streamed while ecosystems and towns drown and the Australian people mourn. The climate crisis is here. It is devastating, but one of the great uniting things about us Aussies and the Yanks across the sea is our search for hope and change. The climate crisis is here, but climate justice is still possible, and that's something I want to speak to tonight, because tonight we are discussing the future of international cooperation and the importance of uplifting marginalised voices, and I can speak on behalf of young people in the queer community. Although I do want to acknowledge that greater space must be afforded to Indigenous sovereign nations, including those in the US and Australia, in international negotiations as well. It is my generation who will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, whose futures are increasingly under threat from flame and flood. And that is what I'm going to speak about. COP26 brought both disappointment and hope for young people. The average age of delegates was 60 years, with some notable exceptions, such as Panama, who actually had an average age of 29 years. But despite that, the Glasgow Climate Pact was also the first COP outcome that expressly mentioned young people, with Article 64 of that pact stating that parties are urged to ensure meaningful youth participation and representation in multilateral, national and local decision-making processes, including under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. But what is meaningful youth participation? What does it say about the COP and how we negotiate power? That youth participation is its own segregated agenda item, just above engagement with Indigenous nations, might I add, rather than being integrated into the overall Glasgow Climate Pact or structures of the UNFCCC. When we talk about youth participation, I want to first distinguish between children and young adults, because in the climate justice space, both groups' voices are very loud and powerful. And I think we're all thinking of a couple of names: Greta Thunberg, Anjali Sharma in Australia, Isra Hersey in America, School Strikers for Climate Action globally, and the many young people that form that movement. These are the names of people and organizations who have, as children, taken on the immense burden of calling for climate action publicly, internationally, powerfully. None of these people are CEOs, politicians, or diplomats. Some are still in high school or recent graduates, but all have had their childhoods tarnished by climate change, and future children will suffer the same impacts. Children are not world leaders, nor are they seeking to be world leaders. Greta Thunberg famously said, "How dare you," to world leaders all the way back in the US in 2019, and she's kept that sentiment up. And her anger, that call, was not as a result of young people being excluded from the upper echelons of climate negotiations or delegations. She was, and rightly still is, angry that our leaders, the generation before us, that are meant to be leaving us a better world to continue to build on, are instead burning it. So when we talk about meaningful participation of children in climate negotiations, what we need to be fighting for is the protection of the human rights of children in climate negotiations. We need to be fighting for their futures so that they can freely enjoy their childhoods. But young adults, like myself, are a different category. Young adult activists, professionals, and leaders deserve a seat at the table of international climate negotiations. We have the skills, the vision, the drive to push for ambitious climate action. And young adults can be meaningfully engaged in international negotiations in two ways. First, we need better integration of young adults into national delegations. For too long, youth engagement at Conference of the Parties and other international forums has been relegated to side events like Youth for Climate and the Conference of Youth. We need young adults in national delegations, learning from and influencing more senior diplomats. This is a particular issue in Australia where we see young people given a platform rather tokenistically, even within DFAT. We need to see a greater elevation of youth voices and authentic youth voices and concerns. And the second part of engaging youth meaningfully, we need the clear demands of young people to be listened to. At COP26, young adults pushed for the phase out of fossil fuel gases to be included in the Glasgow Climate Pact, alongside civil society and Indigenous nations. But that call was not fully heard. The final phrase was phased down, a weakening of language that makes 1.5 degrees and our futures less certain. Now, though that critical negotiation happened on the last few days of COP, indeed, it went into the last night when young people were actually removed from Glasgow and the building. And the only, leftover of young people was a slip of paper left on the floors for delegates to see, begging for delegates to take more serious action. If our voices are not heard, there's not much of a point us being in the room. But more importantly, young adults, like our child siblings, are demanding a seat at the table, not the full weight of decision-making. We are not world leaders. It is the responsibility of individual nations to also meaningfully engage with youth within their constituencies and represent their voices in their negotiations at an international level. Young people need their parents and grandparents fighting for the future. That is the spirit of intergenerational equity. And there are examples of countries, not unfortunately many examples in Australia or the US currently, although I will acknowledge the Biden-Harris administration is ramping this up. But there are examples of countries implementing these principles of youth engagement on a national level. We see in Ireland the use of town halls on the country's climate action plan to meaningfully engage with youth on the actual rollout of things like energy reform and agricultural reform, and the commitments that Ireland should be taking to the Conference of the Parties. The United Kingdom has also convened things like citizen juries to help localise climate solutions. And in Italy and in other parts of Europe, we now see climate change and climate solutions as a part of national curriculum. So we're building up the skills of young people to participate really meaningfully as they enter the workforce from day one. These are the kinds of initiatives that empower young people to engage with their delegates in a way that maximizes the chances of them being heard. But it really does rely on the established players in the US and in Australia setting up those mechanisms to give youth the best chance of having their voices, shout out and be heard. Young people want to be listened to in international negotiations. Our voices are powerful and they are a point of unity across the globe. We all care about the future of our children and grandchildren. We are the next generation fighting for a livable planet, and that is a powerful sentiment. But most importantly, we want to be heard. World leaders are our leaders, and it is time that they protected our interests. And I think that sums up very much what young people are really putting forward in the international space and what we offer. It is both a call to action and a call of hope for the international community.
Thank you, Annika.
That's the end of my speech. Sorry.
That's all good. I was finding my unmute button. Thank you so much, Annika. That was fantastic to hear from you about your generation, your thoughts, your feelings, and those of your peers and those who come after you. It's amazing to hear that you're already thinking of the next generation after yours. And I think that's really, really heartwarming. And I hope, as the generation after yours, I hope that we do better for you than the generation after mine, and further back from there. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for their really fantastic opening statements. I learned a lot. I learned some really, really interesting things that I would love to dig deeper on. The first thing that I'd like to know, though, we're now approaching, the year 2 mark of this pandemic. Year 2, year 3. Time has stopped to exist. So how has that changed things for all of you, and for what you're doing, for what you see as what was the problem before and what's the problem now, or is it the same? What was the solution then? What is the solution now going forward? What have we learned from the pandemic, and how has that changed things? Annika, I'll start with you first and just go in reverse order, I suppose.
Thank you, Nancy. I think that's a really great question. I think for me, the pandemic has had 2 big lessons. I'll start with the sad one and then I'll end with the hopeful one. So the pandemic has really shown us how multifaceted environmental degradation on an international scale is. Ultimately, the increased pressures that we're putting on our ecosystems through habitat clearance from greater trespass into wild ecosystems for things like the wildlife trade, all of that increases the chances of things like a pandemic happening. And we've seen that time and time again in the last 2 decades. We've had a series of epidemics that have basically come out of environmental degradation. And finally, we've had a massive pandemic. And I think what that shows is that when we degrade ecosystems and we have a significant impact on our ecosystem, the impacts of that are going to be multifaceted and they're going to spread, whether, outside of the country, across the globe. And climate change is a very similar story. So that really reinforced to me that we need to do more than just tackle climate change on a technological basis. Technology is absolutely a part of it, but the idea that if we just suck out all of the carbon from the atmosphere and everything will be fine doesn't acknowledge the reality that we're putting too much pressure on our ecosystems right now in a multitude of ways. But the second thing that the pandemic, I think, has really shown is how capable we are of change. Our entire world completely shifted in the interests of our community when the pandemic hit. The idea in 2019 that we'd suddenly all be working from home, perhaps permanently going forwards, I don't think many people would have thought that was very feasible. But when the community needed it on a global scale, the political will was there to enact that. We saw the Australian government taking great action, quite frankly, to support people's incomes and to allow them to stay home. It's a shame that hasn't continued over the course of the pandemic, but at least in the early days, we saw the true power of a responsive government. And unfortunately, in the US, during the early days, we saw the true horrors of an unresponsive government. And that really shows that climate change can be responded to. It can be responded to rapidly, and it can be done in a way that uplifts the community. We have all the technology that we need to make a very steady and accelerating transition to net zero emissions. Dare I say, just zero emissions and remove the net. And the pandemic has shown that when there is political will, there is a way for us to bring our entire community along with us on those major transformations.
That's really wonderfully hopeful. Thank you.
I'll jump in. So I think when the pandemic started, it sort of ended in a way Australians' sense of that we were relatively immune from global problems. We had gone through the global financial crisis pretty much unscathed. We did very well, economically relative to other countries around the world. And generally, we have been quite insulated from global problems. So I think the pandemic coming on our door was a bit of a shock. And it happened right after the Black Summer fires, which was another huge shock. I think that it took the attention away from those fires and the role of climate change at that moment. But I still think it has, the fires themselves had a really strong impact on people's understanding of the influence of climate change right now. But I think the two events happening at the same time has made Australians feel much more insecure and concerned about our place in the world and whether we are as immune to global problems as perhaps was thought previously. But I echo what Annika has said as well, that the capacity to unite the community around a solution that was best for the community at large. I live in Melbourne and I went through, the longest lockdowns in the world, which were done to protect the more vulnerable members of the community. And, it wasn't an easy thing to have done personally. And certainly it wasn't easy for any of the businesses that were very affected. And, there was a whole range of ramifications on lots of different people in different ways, but it showed that we can mobilize ourselves for the benefit of everyone, as well as we're able to change what we're doing when there's political will and there's that public concern. So when they're united, we can move very quickly to solve problems. Like, I think it's just amazing that, I remember at the start of the pandemic, people said, I don't know if we'll ever have a vaccine. And here we are with multiple vaccines. And vaccines that might be able to be, immunize my baby in the next little while. The other point I just wanted to make, so, as Annika said, it shows that, you can change quickly if you want to. I think the influence, I have 2 young children, on families and being able to work with a family is a big shift. I probably wouldn't have been able to do this event if it wasn't online, but because I've got a 10-month-old and a 4-year-old, but, because it is, there's no commute time and all of that, we're able to do it. So I think it has both enabled greater participation in the workforce by women, but also had the opposite effect because women bore the burden of the pandemic in terms of the childcare. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out down the track. For our organisation, for instance, we'll only be back in the office roughly 2 days a week, and it will be very, very flexible. So I'm hoping that flexibility, once we're out of, kind of on the other side of the pandemic, maybe there's opportunities for greater family flexibility in how we work.
Thank you. Yeah, we've noticed the flexibility offered by the pandemic has been fantastic for the AIIA as well. I mean, being able to hold this event right now is because of what we've had to do to change and adapt. Blake, how has the pandemic affected your work and USAID's work?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's when I do events like this, oftentimes, there's questions that you're prepared for, that you have answers for, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I never, honestly, I thought about how it's affected my life. I thought about how it's affected a lot of things, and that the other speakers mentioned about how we work, but then thinking about how it affects development and how it affects, in the context of this particular discussion, climate change. So I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, but I think it to go back to what Annika said, in terms of reinforcing the issue, I did a lot of work on transboundary water resources in Southern Africa, 10, 15 years ago. And they had a saying, what happens upstream affects people downstream, right? And I think, I hate to say it's a positive because, when you look at the hospitalizations and deaths and all the impacts that COVID-19 has had over the past 2 years, those aren't good things, but it has brought home the problem in the front of people's minds in terms of, pandemics, infections, the borders don't matter, right? What happens upstream affects people's downstream. And I think that has applicability when you talk about the issue of climate change. We can't deal with this, with an isolationist perspective, because what we do in one country affects people in other countries. And I think, if anything, COVID-19 has really brought that to the forefront of the way they think about things. Has it changed the problem? Has it changed how we approach? I don't know about that. That's a tough one, because I've been in development for a long time, and problems are some of the same problems that you have in terms of infant mortality and literacy and poverty, inequality, all those things. And so I don't know. That's a tough one. But I want to go back to something that Anik said about political will, because I think that's the key, right? And I'm glad that she brought that up, and I'm glad that that's part of the discussion, because I think at the end of the day, dealing with an issue that doesn't respect borders, dealing with an issue that has upstream and downstream implications, right? There has to be a coordinated global response. Okay, otherwise it's never gonna. It's just gonna continue to get worse in the extreme weather conditions that people talked about. So I think that gets into what I think is really the key issue in terms of political will. And you use the term political. What does that mean? Then you start getting into the politics of it, right? And when you look at countries that have issues with whether it's signing on to the Paris Accord or committing to net zero emissions, it comes down to politics, right? And politics are local. So we're talking about a global problem that can't be dealt with with an isolation perspective. But a lot of times these things get decided on local political issues or national political issues. So I think that as you look at the future, you look at participation in policy forums, you look at the youth voice, which I think is super important that we got to do. You also have to look at the politics of it. And as the speaker said, if there's the political will to do something, it can get done. So to kind of close the loop on that, what I mean by that is that when you look at carbon emissions, and you look at greenhouse gas, and you look at the use of fossil fuels, right? It gets hard to ask a political leader to make commitments that are going to have a negative impact on his constituents or her constituents, right? So then you kind of take it to the next step, and this is where we talk about technology, and we talk about the things that can get us there. And I look at when I first started working on this issue, 20 years ago, and if you look at the cost of hydro, you look at the cost of wind, you look at the solar, and it was prohibitively expensive, right? We've reached a tipping point with some of the technology where you can now produce those things, in many cases that it's more cost effective than fossil fuels, and I think that's what's going to help us kind of turn the page on this and move to the next step is focusing on those things that will help us create a green economy, right? Look at renewables and move beyond fossils, and until we do that, I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard when to get countries to commit to things that they're not going to follow through on, or to get them to commit in the first place if it's going to have a negative impact on the people that elected them in the first place. So back to political will. So I wanted to throw that into the discussion too, that I think that aspect of it, kind of the triple bottom line or the economic approach to looking at these issues, there's huge opportunities there and things that can work, and I think that has to be a key thread or a key part of the discussion going forward on the issue of climate change. Over.
Thank you, Blake. I would like to now take a question from our audience, and please do remember that you can put a question in the type a question into the Q&A box, and we will hopefully answer it. I have someone who wants to know, this is directed to Blake, but I actually would like to hear from Amanda and potentially Annika on this as well. Pacific Island nations face an existential threat when it comes to climate. What are some examples of what the US is doing to support climate mitigation in the Pacific? What is Australia doing? And to add in my own question on that, how do countries like Australia and the US, which are large and wealthy and face their own existential climate threats, balance their foreign aid and climate support to other countries with their own needs, their own domestic needs? Blake, if you'd like to take that one first.
Okay, no, and that's an excellent question, and I really appreciate it. I'm not going to get into specifics about Australia's foreign aid program, because that'd be a little bit outside my lane. I gave the example of the program, not in the Pacific Islands, but in Southeast Asia, and I think you could, similar programs that we do in the Pacific Islands. Now, it's a great question because we haven't been in the region that long, but when you look at the small island nations of the Indo-Pacific, it is an ecstasy. I mean, we talk about, 2 foot of sea rise level, and that means they're going to have to put in more barriers so that their townhouses in Miami don't get flooded. When you talk about the Pacific Island nations, I mean, that could be, nations could be underwater, right? And it is an existential threat. So, it's great when you see something like, the COP, and you have these nations getting up there and saying, we need to do something about this, and that they mean it. So, that's an important thing. Now, examples of what we do, I mean, happy to provide more information offline, but there are a lot of examples of what we do, but basically it's driven by host country needs and what we call, kind of putting them on a path to self-reliance, right? So, it can be financing, okay? It can be financing for renewables, which we're doing in some of the Pacific Island nations. We have a huge partnership actually with Australia in Papua New Guinea, called the Papua New Guinea Electrification Partnership, right? And we're looking at, improving access to electricity, reducing emissions, those types of things. We also look at livelihoods, and we have a number of great programs in the Pacific to look at, say, for example, for a lot of countries, aquaculture or fisheries is a huge, and it's a way of life, but it's also huge, generates income and revenue. Looking at sustainable fishing and the impact that the climate change has on that, and how they do those things. So a lot of examples. In addition to, we do education in a number of countries. In this, so there's a few quick examples of what we do. In terms of prioritizing, I mean, that's a tough question. You guys could do we could do a separate event on that one, right? Because I've been with USA for 16 years. Every time I go home on home leave, I get, someone in my family asks, why are you guys building roads in Afghanistan and the roads in Bend, Oregon are falling apart, and I have to talk about, okay, well, let's understand, that what we do supports American prosperity and American security, and why. Why is it important? When 60% of the U.S. economy depends on exports and imports, and we're all interlinked in a global economy. So, I mean, that's kind of the long and short answer to that question. I hear that all the time. We have our own needs in the U.S., and we are facing, an existential crisis from the impact of climate change. But I think looking at, what we do in the U.S. and how we help other countries and how we work and partner with other countries to address the issue is important for our own domestic prosperity, our own domestic security, and explaining that in the U.S. and explaining that to policymakers is part of what I do. And I think it just goes back to what I said. This is a problem that can't be dealt with, on an isolated manner. It is a global issue, and the solutions out there we're only gonna get to where we want to be if we work together. So that's an important aspect, I think, also of that question. I'll stop there. Over.
Thank you. Amanda, do you want to jump in with the Australian perspective?
Yeah, I think that for most of the developed countries, it's pretty disingenuous, personally, to provide aid to adapt or to tackle climate change. Like, it's a minuscule amount of emissions that's coming from the Pacific. The money would be better spent on tackling climate change globally. As Blake said, it's a global issue. If we're not fundamentally getting our emissions down, aid to the Pacific is on a few solar panels here and there, just tinkering around the edges. I think that from an Australian perspective, the government in saying we'll reduce emissions 26 to 28% and then net zero by 2050 with no plan to get there. If the rest of the world was doing what we're doing, that would be a 3-degree plus world. So we'd see much of the Pacific in vulnerable regions like Kiribati, for instance, underwater. So if that's our strategy, we should be providing visas. This is not about a little bit of aid money here and there. This is people will have nowhere to go. So if it was a genuine, Australia's policy is essentially let climate change rip. That's where the federal government has landed on this. So if that's their policy, they should be honest with the Pacific. So obviously that's not what we want. Our friends in the Pacific, as well as in Australia, the Torres Strait is highly vulnerable in the same way, are arguing, we need to tackle emissions, and they've been arguing very powerfully for some years that we need to get emissions down really rapidly and stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, because that's where the existential threat lies for them. And, that's of benefit, obviously, to Australia as well. These catastrophes that we're experiencing are enormously costly. So that's where we stand on it.
Thank you. That's a position that you don't necessarily hear very often. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Annika, did you want to jump in on there?
Yeah, well, I really echo Amanda's comments in this regard. I think it is disingenuous. It's not very neighbourly of Australia and other developed countries to not be acknowledging the fact that it is our historical and ongoing emissions that is causing climate change. And indeed, in Australia's unique case, it is very much our coal exports that are causing climate change. We are really keeping that alive in a way that most other countries aren't, with the way that we support the coal export industry. But the one thing I want to pick up that Amanda mentioned really rightly about visas in Kiribati and sinking of the islands is, I think the other thing we have to acknowledge is that there is no room for white saviours when it comes to our engagement with the Pacific. Climate change is largely, if not completely, basically caused by historical emissions in developed countries that are predominantly white and for the benefit of white Western countries. And when we look at the Pacific, in many ways, Pacific Islanders and activists and academics are rightly calling climate change the latest phase in colonisation. It's an extension of those white Western ways of living, which are now the Pacific's Western ways of dying. So that's a really important point. And it also means that when we look at what we should be doing on the ground in the Pacific, when we look at communities in places like Vanuatu, Kiribati, Fiji, it is local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, that increases the resilience of those communities. It's not Western intervention. And whilst I absolutely agree with Amanda about the visas point and the fact that we should be offering visas, I think we must also acknowledge that Pacific Islanders do not want to lose their homes. They don't want a visa to Australia. They want their homes to be protected. They want extra dredging to lift up the shorelines of Kiribati. And when we look at the most successful outcomes for communities, so I'm thinking of the cyclones that have hit Vanuatu in the last couple of years, the houses that were built with traditional Ni Vanuatu knowledge, called cyclone houses, literally, survived far better than Western style built concrete houses and timber houses that were shattered and very difficult to put back together. And I think that really shows that when we talk about aid and development and cooperation between Australia and the US and the Pacific, there must be an acknowledgement that we are accounting for historical wrongs and contemporary wrongs. We are not saviours in this narrative. And secondly, that the best thing we can do is uplift and support community knowledge, resilience, and empowerment in the Pacific, because that's where the best outcomes are.
I love that. Thank you. I would like to now turn to current events, current pressing events. Specifically, we have Stacey who asks, how is will the war in Ukraine and how will global energy markets affect the probability of decreasing carbon emissions? Annika, you talked about the controversy between phasing down and phasing out, then turning into phasing down fossil fuels. And now that Europe's energy is, it possibly in crisis. Who knows how that will end up, and how energy is kind of at the core, if not at the core, but certainly very much on the priority list of what will we do about Ukraine. How is that going to change things? What do you think?
I think there are two components to the Ukraine war, or Ukraine invasion, perhaps is apt. And so the first one I'm going to touch on very briefly is the nuclear component. We know that there's been threats to nuclear energy in Ukraine. And I think it rightly highlights that when we're looking at new energy systems, and the choices that we can be making, particularly in Australia as a non-nuclear energy state, that there are massive risks involved with nuclear that just don't exist with other renewable energy options. And I think that raises a really important question about how we can be supporting Ukraine going forwards for their energy security during this crisis, with things like microgrids and portable batteries and solar panel packs to overcome the challenges that they have with a nuclear fleet of energy, and the need to really move away from that type of energy despite it not being strictly a fossil fuel. And the second part of the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine invasion, is of course the fact that Russia's actually getting windfall gains from the oil and gas crisis that we're seeing in Europe right now, and the challenges that we're seeing with supply. And what that really shows is that we talk about renewable energy as a climate solution. And renewable energy is absolutely a climate solution, but it is also a security solution. It allows states to truly be independent with their energy in a way that they couldn't be decades ago. It allows individual communities within Australia and the US or Ukraine or Europe to be independent and sovereigns over their own energy security. And that uplifts communities. It breaks down the oligarchies that allow these kinds of power dynamics to emerge that have led to things like the Ukraine invasion. And so I think that this should be a real learning moment for world leaders, both in Europe and outside of Europe, to reflect on the importance of transitioning to a green grid for security, not just for climate action, although I would argue our single greatest threat to our security is climate change anyway. But for more traditional security threats, energy security is a big part of what it means to be a stable country. It's one of the things that gets threatened most heavily in the lead up to wars and during wars historically, and very much in the contemporary. And so I think this is a moment where we should be seeing a real pivot in Europe towards green energy, and that should be very strongly supported by Australia and the US.
Thank you. Amanda or Blake, would you like to jump in there? No? Okay, thank you so much. Blake?
Oh, no, I mean, jumping into the Ukraine foreign policy question of the moment, I'd probably lose my job if I get too deep into it. But just to agree with what Annika said, I mean, it goes back to what I said too. I mean, at the end of the day, it does come down to kind of the real politic of it. And, I'm reading an article, or was reading an article earlier, that gas is about $4 a gallon in the US for the first time since 2008, right? So this is definitely going to have an impact on how people look at this. And again, I mean, that's why I think it's so important. We've reached that convergence point where, renewable energy can be generated, it's less expensive than fossil fuels. And I think that what's going on in Ukraine right now, and the concerns about the global markets, I mean, that's just gonna, if there's any positive for the suffering that's going on right now in Ukraine, and 1.5 million refugees gonna go higher, is that as Annika said, maybe it'll help us move away from a reliance on on fossil fuel. But again, I mean, it's going to be because of the cost, and it's going to be because of the technology. I mean, that's what's going to drive it. I mean, all you have to do is look at, where we've gotten fossil fuels from in the past, and whether it's an autocratic regime or whatever. I mean, if it keeps the price of gas down, most Western countries haven't had a problem with that. So I do think, emphasizing or bootstrapping that point again is that I do think, technology and at the end of the day, people's pocketbooks, their jobs, and their ability to provide for their family. It's good to talk about some of the things on the higher policy level. It's good, say what you want about how we do development assistance and whether you think it adds value or not. But at the end of the day, it is about people's self-reliance and their ability to do things. And I think that a lot of the technology that's out there and that continues to develop is really what I have a lot of hope and optimism for. Over.
Thank you. I would like to move on to another question from our audience. It's not quite a question, but I'm going to add a question onto it. Victoria Pierce notes that it's important that we saw the universal banning of CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, in a matter of a few years. I believe that was through the Montreal Protocol to prevent acid rain and ozone destruction. However, further global unity has ceased. How are all of you dealing with, and what are your thoughts on the increasing polarization in society? How is that affecting the way that your organizations are able to be effective in addressing climate change? And what can we do? How can we move forward in an increasingly polarized world? Amanda, do you want to take that to start? We can't hear you, Amanda.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
It was a far less complicated issue, the CFCs, politically, because there was not the substantial vested interests that we're up against in terms of coal, oil, and gas. It's just a total multiple orders of magnitude more challenging politically to climate change versus CFCs. So although that's a good example of how the world came together to solve a problem, I don't think it is comparable. And actually, I think the world is doing reasonably well, 30-year period to be tackling, globally tackling these issues. If it wasn't so urgent, we'd probably think, the world's doing pretty well at tackling it. It's just unfortunately happening so quickly, and mobilizing the whole world to get out of the dominant fuel sources of the 20th century, which have powered, the most wealthy states ever. It is a pretty big challenge. So I think it's important to remember that. But that how do we do it? A number of the questions in the chat are really about that, like what is it going to take to get the level of change required? And I think that climate change, because it is such a big issue, often people can feel like they have no agency, whereas in fact, Greta Thunberg's an example of a 15-year-old girl that just did her best. And I think that's what's incumbent on all of us. We all have a sphere of influence, whether it's, solar panels on the roof of your kid's school, whether it's thinking about the business that you work for and influencing them, whether it's the government that you work for. There's lots of ways that each of us can think about our circle of influence and think about being brave. I often say to people, how lucky are we to be alive right now when we have such issues of importance that we can work on? And what a privilege to be at that point in time. Like my children, my son is almost 1. By the time that he's an adult, he won't be able to tackle this issue. It'll be decided to a large degree. This decade is the critical period of time. So I think for anyone that's got any agency at all, it's incumbent on us to do everything that we can. And often that's hard to work out what exactly it is. But once you start sort of looking at it, there are lots of opportunities, and there's so many examples of people doing their best.
Can I just jump and add to what Amanda has really eloquently said about circles of influence, and I want to touch on that polarization point that you raised, Nancy, because we know from cognitive science that people get into their political spheres, and it is very hard to change people's minds, downright impossible, in fact, to change people's minds based on facts. But we can come together on a community level with the people that we know within our personal circles, and have values-based conversations that will change people's minds, and engage in values-based campaigns that will lead to local solutions. So a great example of that is, at one level, you have a politician speaking about climate change and the importance of it, and have it lead to progressives thinking one thing and conservatives typically thinking another. But on a more personal level, with the people in your lives, you can be having conversations about how great it is to be having a renewable energy project at your school that helps your kids have more secure power so they can learn. And you're having that conversation with the kids' grandparents, who might be typically conservative, but really care about family and education. And you can get through to them on that values basis. And I think we really need to acknowledge the importance of engaging in a local level, engaging with compassion and love at a local level with the people around us to enact change. Ultimately, and I think someone did raise a question about how can you engage youth meaningfully if you don't have international reach as a local organisation. I would say that, honestly, organisations that operate on an international level have a harder time of engaging youth, and rightly so, because when you're a young person very worried about the state of the world and the state of climate change, jumping headfirst into the international cooperative group between Australia and the US, and looking at the total emissions between the two countries and reducing them, is overwhelming, arguably crushing for the average person. But looking at it at a community level, where you're the local group going in and restoring the wetlands, and you're getting down in the bog, and you can see progress as a local group, as a young person, or indeed any person, that's where hope really flourishes. And that's where love and community ties really flourish, which is how we're all going to be brought together on this journey. It sounds very hippie-ish, but I really do believe that at the heart of climate action is compassion for each other. And we can talk about compassion on the international stage, and we can talk about it, about getting youth involved internationally with aspiration and great words. But the more powerful compassion is actually doing that on a local level with the people around us. And that's where the change really does come from. And voting with climate action in mind about your local representative, that also makes a big difference.
Thank you. Like you mentioned, all politics is local as well. I think that's absolutely a theme here. What's your take on this?
Yeah, a really good question. I mean, the question about polarization, I mean, that's really a tough one. Hearing some of the other comments, I represent the country that's the number 2 largest emitter of greenhouse gas in the world, right? So you have to look at, how are we going to solve these problems, but I do look at the US, and I look at, I think we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions on average, going back to 2006, so I mean, there has been an effort there. And I think, what I saw when we pulled out of the Paris Accord was a lot of the optimism that Annika's talking about at the community level, at the state, at the subnational level, where my home state, California, signed on to the Paris Accord. I mean, they couldn't because they're a state, but you saw a lot of that happening. So that those kind of conversations and people coming together on those issues were going on, even if they weren't necessarily going to support the national. So I think that's exactly the right conversation to have. I mean, maybe just to end, because I do, I tend to tell stories, right? And I sometimes get in trouble for them. But anyway, when I was overseas, when I first started doing development, it was actually over 20 years ago, right? And I was working in a country, the former Soviet Union, a very poor country, and we got a call from our headquarters saying that they wanted us to introduce a recycling program into the community, right? And here, we're doing school feeding, we're looking at massive famine, huge public health issues, and they want us to go put, green, yellow, and red bins into a community. I did what I needed to do. I went in and I talked to people, and they looked at me like, "Oh, Blake, are you kidding? I can't feed my kids. I can't get medicine for my wife. All I want is a job and a roof over my head, and you want me to sort my trash?" I mean, I'm like, "Oh, but it's an environmental issue and all that," right? I tell that story just to kind of put a thread around some of the other things I've said, is that it does come down to how it affects people individually and in their communities, right? And until you start looking at those issues and understanding those issues, you're going to continue to have polarization. You're going to continue to have issues where it doesn't seem like we can come together as a state, a territory, a nation, as the world to address them. But you have to look at from the lens of how they affect people, right? And how they can provide for their families, for education, for healthcare, those types of things, and how that integrates into that. And if you miss out on that, all the conversations and all the hope and all the optimism, you're going to have a hard time getting anything done if you're not cognizant of that fact. So I think I mentioned that, like I said, just because it kind of ties in some other things I said, but I think it also gets at the issue of political will and local politics and polarization, and how we get people elected in the first place that maybe don't, share some of the same views that we have. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Over.
Thanks, Blake. I have a follow-up question to that, actually. That you've worked across administrations, you've worked across different political leadership, different viewpoints in political leadership, I suppose. How has that affected you as an employee of USAID, and how does that affect the organization whenever you have a different party in leadership at a given time? Right.
No, and I really appreciate that question, Nancy, and it's a great question. I'm a civil servant, so I'm part of the executive branch, so I work at the pleasure of the White House. So I've worked under multiple administrations, and we do serve the or we follow the leadership of our White House. So I think that's you have to look at, as a development professional, that's the lens that I look through. I don't look through a political lens, right? I don't look through a legal lens. I don't look through, a business lens. I look at a problem as a development professional, and whatever that problem is, whether we're talking about climate change, or if it's public health, if it's education, if it's looking at marginalized communities. And as a development professional, you look at like what are the tools that I have in my toolkit, and how can I move the needle? How can I have impact, right? And then you figure out, how do you work under the stated goals, the national security strategy that comes out of the White House that says these are the things that are important to us, and I spent a lot of time when I was in Washington under the previous administration talking to political folks about why what we do is good for American prosperity and American security, right? So, whether you believe in America first or not, and that's not a discussion that I want to have, when you're talking to political leadership, if that's the lens that they look through, then you have to tell them why it's in America's interest to have healthy, stable, democratic countries, whether it's in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and why that's good for Americans, right? And why interconnected matters, and those types of things. So I guess that kind of a long way to answer your question is that the development challenges, in my 20+ year career, the development challenges don't change. The leadership does, right? So you have to think about how you translate solutions to those development challenges based on the strategic chapeau that political leadership puts in place, and how do you support those things? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. It really does. It's a good reminder that the government is not its leader, and that the work of civil servants is ongoing regardless of who's in charge. All right. Well, I would like to end on a final question, and this is from somebody in our audience who asked Annika, and they answered in part, and so I would like Annika to end us off tonight. So I'm going to throw this out to Blake and then to Amanda. How do you see your organization? So how do you see USAID? How do you see a climate council? How do you see your government engaging youth meaningfully, especially when they don't have, if or when they don't have an international platform?
Did you say I should go first or Blake?
Go for it, Amanda.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And on the climate challenge, of course, as has been eloquently put, the younger you are, the worse that you're going to be affected, because you'll live through the century. And of course, the more vulnerable you are in terms of where you live, geography will be quite defining in terms of how serious the climate crisis will be for you. And obviously there's racial dimensions and cultural dimensions that are layered over that as well. Generally, those that are marginalised will be more impacted. So where I have seen really good youth engagement, it's where young people are truly valued for the perspective that they can offer rather than tokenism. When I started an organisation called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, and I remember being engaged lots of the time in like a kind of tick box exercise. So come into the office, tell us what you think. We tell you why you're wrong. Now go home. Versus occasionally you'd have a really nice interaction where even if the person, the sort of grown up in the leadership position, didn't necessarily agree with you, they genuinely wanted to hear a perspective, and there was genuine dialogue. So I think it's about an attitude change in the listener, if you like, that the grown up hearing the information versus like, you know, respecting the value that you can get from hearing different perspectives. I think that that's happening now in terms of there's a lot of information, for instance, on boardrooms, that a more diverse board makes better decisions. And that can be true in terms of a whole range of different aspects of diversity. And I think that's true of public decisions, that we need to be consultative and understanding different perspectives to hear how it's going to be beneficial or not. And my perspective in working on climate change for a long time, it's been very useful to have youth advocates to bring a clarity of thinking. I think often once people get to a position of political power, they've had, you know, there's lots of kind of back and forth as to thinking about different interests. But I think where Greta Thunberg and the other youth activists globally on climate, what they've been able to do is just bring it back to exactly why this matters. That this is about, do we have a safe future or do we not have a safe future? And what is the responsibility of the grown-ups? The responsibility is to protect the future, number one. It's not to line the pockets of certain industries or, you know, satisfy different lobby groups. So I think that clarity of argument is often extremely useful for leaders to hear.
Thank you. Blake?
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate the question on youth, and I think that's a great way to end. And especially since I'm probably the oldest person on this too, so you know, I don't know if that means anything, but you know, I'm a former grade school teacher, so my background is in education. So I mean, you know, you're kind of what we say, preaching to the choir here. I mean, I don't, you know, I've been around long enough to know. I mean, you know, look, I think over half the world's population is under the age of 30. You start looking at the youth bulge when it gets into the developing countries. The question was about my organization and what we do. You look at the youth bulge in the countries where we work, and you know, it's even higher. There's places where, you know, if the demographic is under 35, it's like 60-70% of the country. So you know, just given what we do and how we do it, you know, you can't, you know, you have to look at that, you know, and you know, I think, you know, what I've learned from my experience is really that, you know, educated, healthy, employed, engaged youth will drive economic growth. They'll drive democracy, prosperity, and the inverse of that is that it can, you know, when we don't do those things and we don't engage youth, you know, you're looking at, you know, it can lead to violence, instability, unrest, you know, all those things. So you know, I 100% agree. You know, it is integrated in our approach to community development and local leadership and local self-reliance. So it's kind of pre-baked or pre-cooked into what we do. Maybe just to end, you know, the going back to that, my experience I talked about 20 years ago, and in that same country, we had a program at the time where we taught civic education, right? So this was, you know, understanding what it means to be a participating member of a democratic society. And we taught it was a nationwide program, and we taught it in grade schools and high schools. And I won't get into the specifics of the program, but you know, that we had nationwide coverage. It was a USAID program, and Fast forward 20 years, and children, youth who participated in that program, and I know, went on to be members of parliament. We had one person actually went on to be prime minister. So these were people that had, as youth, they got an education on what it means to be, a participating member of democratic society, and how things function at the local level and at the provincial level, and how at the national level. And then they use those tools and skills to go on and lead their country. So that's just a perfect example. When you're talking about youth, it's obviously important to engage them. They're part of the solution. But it's also a long-term investment. And the things that we do now, working with youth, as speaking on behalf of USAID, will affect the future, because what someone said, everybody at Davos was like over 60, and most of them were white. I mean, okay, so hopefully 20 years from now that won't be the case, right? And or the people that are there are people that grew up, and got an education and understand what it means to be part of a global community. So, again, I'm trying to be optimistic here, so I'll step on that over.
Thank you so much, Blake. And Annika, to end the evening, what are your final thoughts on getting the young people involved and making sure that people like Amanda's son are set up well for their future?
Yeah, well, I think so perhaps I'll start actually with my organization, Green Law. So it's a youth-led organization. All of our executive are youth. We do have a board that advises us that are not all youth, but it is very much youth-led. And our research has informed national debates about environmental laws in this country. It has been cited in international negotiations, in the Antarctic Treaty Party system. We have appeared before inquiries, we've appeared before media. We've done Australia First research on threatened species management, on energy law reform and human rights. Young people, and in particular, I do mean young adults, I think there is a difference with how we should be protecting children, quite frankly, and ensuring that their rights are upheld instead of forcing them basically to advocate for their own rights. But young adults have so much to offer in this space. There is an incredible drive, there is incredible clarity for what needs to be done, as Amanda has said. And what we really need to see within organisations and government is a willingness to take on that vision, a willingness to take on that passion. For local organisations, your local NGO, or if any of you are a part of think tanks or not-for-profits, that means, meaningfully getting youth involved in whatever major projects you're doing. That means letting youth have a seat at the table so that they can see the impact that their passion has. A lot of young people are rightly very, very anxious, very, very depressed, dreading the future and what climate change holds for all of us. When I think about my father's, one of his favorite anecdotes is that he sobbed as he held me when I was born. I was the eldest child, and it was all very exciting. And I can't help but think whether I will be sobbing if I have a child, or whether I will be choking on smoke, as so many parents did during the Black Summer bushfires, particularly in Canberra Hospital, because we didn't have the ventilation. How will the most joyous days of my life be tarnished by climate change? Or will my life be cut short by climate change? And of course, I'm sitting in a privileged position in the global north saying this. So young people are incredibly anxious, but that anxiety can be, through compassion, through community, be addressed, and youth can feel empowered. I've seen this time and time again with Green Law, with other young people saying to me, I was so isolated in my feelings about climate action, thinking that I'd be walking away from the movement and sticking my head in the sand, until I was in a room with other young people being built up, or until I was in a room with other people being uplifted and empowered. So I hope from all the topics that we've traversed tonight that we can leave with a sense of urgency of action, because the climate crisis is most definitely urgent, but also a sense of hope and agency. The climate crisis is not outside of our control. It's not outside of the control of young people. Climate justice is still possible. It is still attainable. And the pathways towards climate justice are community ones. It's when we hold our hands side by side and work towards community-based solutions, renewable energy solutions, agricultural solutions, dare I say, improving democracy and transparency of the political process through community-led solutions. We are up against massive changes, but if the pandemic, if the crises of decades gone by have shown us anything, it's that humanity is able to rapidly change for the benefit of the community. But what drives that change is the community. It is people standing up and fighting for that change. And I think that's what youth really embody. And it's really beholden on organizations to accept that energy and let it build them up and to contribute to the work that they're doing.
Thank you so much, Annika. And that leaves us on exactly the right note, in that the Australian Institute of International Affairs is a community-based organization. We are a membership-based organization, and we deeply value our student members, our early career professionals through our AAA Next Gen network, and through each of our state and territory branches. We now have a presence all over the country, and we want to hear from you. If you are interested in more events like this, we would love to hear from you about what you want to hear about. Our mission is to enable Australians to know more, understand more, and engage more in international affairs, and that is all Australians at every walk of life. So thank you so much, Annika, for really emphasizing the community portion of what is possible in this space. And it's wonderful to hear how we, the AAA, can take that and move forward with this. And hopefully some of our readers our listeners will be able to take that as well. So we are now at the end of our webinar. Thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in tonight. Thank you so much to our audience. Thank you so much to our expert speakers, Amanda, Annika, and Blake. It's been fantastic hearing from you. I've learned so much about where we're at and where we can go. And I'm optimistic for the future. That is a wonderful outcome for this evening. So thank you all, and good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.